Clinical operations and pharmacovigilance are critical to trial success, yet they are too often managed in isolation. In early phase and complex studies, this disconnect can lead to delayed safety decisions, protocol amendments, operational inefficiencies, and increased burden on study teams and sites. We're joined by two industry experts today: Deborah Kintop, Senior Vice President, Strategic Solutions and Patient Centricity at Ergomed Clinical Research, and Svietza Bielin, Executive Medical Director at Prime Vigilance. They will share practical insights on how earlier integration between clinical operations, medical monitoring, and pharmacovigilance can improve study oversight and strengthen benefit risk decision making from the outset. They will explore where silos commonly emerge across study design and trial conduct, how integrated planning can reduce downstream challenges, and what sponsors can do to create a more connected approach to safety and clinical execution. And you'll walk away with strategies to improve operational readiness, reduce risk, support patient safety, and help keep complex studies on track. I'm your host, James Crosspayne with Clinical Leader. I'd like to thank you, the audience, for attending today's event. This is live, so we do encourage your participation. Take a moment to get comfortable with the tools on your screen. Below me, you'll find our presenters' contact information. Below the slides, there are a handful of resources for additional learning. To the right, you'll find a few questions our presenters have asked of you. Please take a moment to share your thoughts with us to help dictate the discussion. We also encourage you to expand further using the Q&A box that's just above. We'll answer as many of your questions as possible after the presentation, and any we miss, I'll pass along for follow-up after the event. This question box can connect you with me if you run into any trouble, but please try refreshing your browser first, as it will fix most common issues. Finally, today's event will be available on demand. You'll receive an email with a shareable link shortly after we conclude. Now, without further ado, let's begin today's presentation. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you, James, very much for the introduction. I think before we get into the presentation, it would really be great if those of you in the audience could help us by answering a question, really helping us understand at what stage is PV usually involved in your clinical trial planning. So if you could take a few moments and answer which of these options most likely aligns with your current situation. All right. Hopefully everyone has had an opportunity to answer. I will move us on to see what our results show. So it looks like majority, or like a large percentage, are really through during the protocol design stage, which is great. There's another large percentage that are at study startup before FPI. Some of you said after protocol finalization, and I think it varies by study or sponsor. I think that's probably in line with kind of what we see in the customers we're talking with. So it looks like there's quite a variety of kind of when this integration occurs, which is not surprising. I hope by the end of our presentation that we can kind of give some insights to all of you, no matter kind of where you fall in that process. So again, very great to see and appreciate the responses from everyone on the phone with us today. I hope that our presentation will provide some insights no matter what your approach is currently. Our goal for today is really to cover where the disconnect tends to emerge between the two functions, what the consequences are, and what integration really looks like in practice. And this starts from protocol design to signal management and risk oversight. We'll close with practical steps that, from our perspective, can help sponsors support the integration of clinical operations and pharmacovigilance throughout the study lifecycle. Before we dive into where disconnects emerge, let's take a little bit of time to talk about why it matters. So when we talk about things like early phase oncology or rare disease programs, there is often no historical safety reference to work from for this first-in-human dosing. Consequently, the protocol reflects a sponsor's best estimate of a safe starting dose and a manageable escalation scheme. But the actual risk profile only reveals itself as the study progresses. In this environment, the speed and quality of safety decision-making is critically dependent on clinical and PV functions. having shared visibility into the data, shared decision pathways, and shared understanding of how to interpret and respond to safety events. In addition, regulatory requirements have shifted. With the recent ICH E6R3, it's explicit that risk management should be prospective, proportionate to the criticality of the risks identified, and integrated across functions throughout a trial. And a recent FDA guidance confirms that even when clinical operations and pharmacovigilance are outsourced, the sponsor retains direct accountability for oversight, quality, and safety decision-making. What this means in practice is that the governance structures sponsors put in place when designing a study, how decisions are made, who participates, what triggers a joint review, are key mechanisms for protecting patient safety.
And the key stakeholders who need to closely collaborate in order to ensure patient safety are, of course, investigators, medical monitors, and the pharmacovigilance or safety group. Investigators, of course, mainly decide on subject inclusion, exclusion, eligibility for the study, and they need to closely monitor the safety and well-being of those subjects throughout the study throughout the study conduct, ensuring that safety events are managed and also reported. Not necessarily in that order. Sometimes they need to first report and then start managing it. Medical monitors, on the other hand, need to ensure overall study data integrity and completeness and comprehensiveness. So these two functions basically together need to ensure that there is a comprehensive data available for safety analysis when we look at it from this perspective. Although there are different approaches to the handling of the safety function, at Pharmacovigilance we use the terms clinical safety and pharmacovigilance, or PV, interchangeably. And we typically have the same pharmacovigilance physicians leading these safety teams and covering all the requirements under this umbrella. So these activities include focus on individual patient, right? Such as promptly processing adverse events, requesting follow-up which is needed, performing independent sponsor causality assessments, and so a back and forth communication with the investigator about individual patients. On the other hand, there are also activities related to detection, assessment, understanding, and prevention of adverse reactions and safety risks. And these require looking at the accumulated data set, so not just individual patient, not just one study, but what gets accumulated across all the sites, all the studies, ongoing and completed. And the purpose is to characterize the overall safety profile of the drug, to keep characterizing it as we learn more and more, to identify patterns of risks or signals that may not be obvious from a review of single patient or even review of individual patients as such. So key activities including trends, as Deborah already mentioned, include looking for signals when some specific adverse reactions are appearing more frequently than expected, and on compiling what is regulatory required with aggregate reports such as developmental safety update reports, and of course other documentation related to the study, maintaining IB, also from the safety part of the IB, right? An informed consent form, which is then shared with the patients. It's nowadays also considered best practice to also create safety surveillance plan, as Deborah mentioned, highlighted in the recent FDA guidances published in December last year, and also to facilitate signal detection and involving characterization of the product safety profile by creating the developmental risk management plan early on and then maintaining it as the clinical program progresses. In an ideal clinical trial environment, clinical and safety would function in a seamless loop. However, in practice, they sometimes operate in silos, well, maybe even often. Disconnect may stem from structural, technical, or regulatory factors that separate the people collecting the data from the people analyzing them. And here you can see some common reasons why these functions may be disconnected. So first, there is a data lag between the systems. Most trials use at least two distinct databases. Sometimes if they are global, they can use even more than that for various technical reasons. One of the databases is the clinical database or electronic data capture. And then the second one is the global safety database, which serves for regulatory reporting and also for signal detection and so on from that source. So if these systems are not integrated via an automated bridge, and that is very rare still, data must be manually reconciled and regularly. Any delays in entering data into the EDC can lead to a blind spot for the PV team. And of course, we don't want disconnects either way in overblowing the number of SUSARs or reducing it unnecessarily just because of a disconnect. Then we have, of course, also differing interpretations of causality. So investigators have their clinical hat on, and they may be looking at an event, for example, a patient's rash, in the context of using a new laundry detergent, and they attribute it to this in the individual patient. On the other hand, the PV team look at aggregate data, and they may see there are 20 rashes across 20 different sites. So there, it may look like a signal of allergic reactions, and then we would dig further to see whether it is or not. So if there aren't close communication, but also independent kind of at different viewpoints at the data, there can be missed signals, and later on it's harder to remediate it. Then we have the outsourcing factor. So sponsors often outsource trial operations to CROs, and disconnects can occur if one CRO manages the clinical sites, another CRO manages the global safety database and safety reporting. So if these different companies, or it can be even different departments, part of it can be within the sponsor company. But if they don't have a seamless flow of information, then they have to follow rigid safety management plans, right? So that's a standard procedure always in place to describe how safety information flows. And these plans need to be very detailed. If they are not detailed, if they are not well defined, then some critical nuances can be missed, such as relevant patient history. It can be lost between handoffs between the two organizations, and sponsor can unnecessarily declare something to be a SUSAR when in fact there was a more plausible explanation somewhere, just not communicated. And then we have regulatory reporting deadlines. So the PV team is typically under pressure to meet these deadlines. They are mostly 15-day, but there are also 7-day deadlines for fatal and life-threatening adverse events. And the focus on the speed can sometimes override the investigators' need for a thorough patient workup, and before the diagnosis is made, before the cause is confirmed from their clinical point of view. So again, this is an area where seamless communication is really of utmost importance. And also not just for the initial report, but to continue being in touch and following up how the clinical diagnosis is progressing. And then finally, we have organizational silos, because these functions typically report to different executives within the company, and they may not have a, let's say, common objective defined clearly as a common objective, although it should always be such. And the PV can be viewed as a back-end function rather than a proactive partner in the trial design. And this again may lead to some disconnects and steps.
Perfect. So continuing on, when we might see silos emerge during study planning and conduct, as we alluded to earlier, silos tend to appear at the points where one function creates an output that another function then has to operationalize without necessarily having been part of the original decision. So let's talk through about 5 areas where this might happen. First, protocol strategy and eligibility. For any study, but particularly in early phase and rare disease programs, the question of who is eligible is not purely a scientific decision. It's also a safety decision. Yet experience is really present at protocol design. So stopping rules, eligibility criteria, adverse event thresholds, and follow-up periods are often drafted without PV input. even though these decisions directly shape the risk profile of the enrolled population. Clinical safety and PV expertise should be embedded in eligibility review from the outset, rather than reviewing a finalized protocol after the fact. Second, safety surveillance planning. If this plan is written by PV in isolation after the protocol is locked, without operational input on what sites can realistically execute, it creates a gap between what the plan requires and what happens in the real world.
And thirdly, the EDC, right, and the safety database alignment. So as we mentioned earlier, when clinical data resides in the EDC, adverse event data resides in the global safety database, inconsistencies can accumulate over the course of the study due to different coding conventions, missing narratives, causality discrepancies, and duplicate records, which are sometimes difficult to distinguish follow-up from a duplicate case. These inconsistencies affect signal quality. They slow down ICSR report processing and reporting potentially also, and they create discrepancies in aggregate safety reports, which then need to be explained and investigated at the data log and may create stress if they are investigating under such time pressure. And fourthly, we have the SUSARs, right? Suspected unexpected serious adverse reactions. These timelines and obligations differ country by country. Differences can be very significant. So one case is reportable to one country and is definitely not reportable to another country at the same time point. In a multi-regional program, a SUSAR in one territory may also trigger reconsent obligations at other sites. So if clinical and PV teams are not operating from a shared understanding of the regulatory landscape, these dependencies can get missed and there can be regulatory non-compliance. And then finally, we have signal detection and risk management. They are often treated as PV-only activities, but that should not be so. Operational context makes these activities more accurate. And we have also seen some risk minimization measures designed without input from study teams who understood what can actually be implemented at the site level.
These silos that we've been talking about have consequences, which I think we can speak to from practical experience over the years. To start with, decisions regarding safety escalations, dose holds, and protocol queries take longer than clinical context and PV judgment when clinical context and PV judgment aren't synchronized. Research has shown that 76% of clinical trials undergo protocol amendments, and usually this is not just one, which can be costly. Safety-related changes are consistently among the top drivers of these amendments, which may include changes to stopping criteria, AE classification standards, and eligibility definitions. Often these changes could have been identified and corrected at the protocol design stage if the right people were in the loop. And keep in mind that the downstream cost of a safety-related amendment goes far beyond the amendment fee itself, to include IRB re-review, potential reconsent at every active site, CRA retraining, site retraining, regulatory notification in some jurisdictions, or even an enrollment hold or study termination. Inconsistencies between the EDC and safety database can also be costly if mismatches need to be corrected at data lock. Agreeing on shared standards and a regular reconciliation process can really prevent this. Regarding site burden, when investigators receive conflicting safety instructions or redundant follow-up queries that seem to contradict what they've already submitted, they lose confidence in the sponsor. This loss of confidence impacts data quality, complicates enrollment, and can make the program less attractive for future studies.
So in our view, there are 6 components of truly integrated clinical and safety model. The first one is the safety surveillance plan that is, as we encourage, should be developed by the clinical operations and PV together and before first patient in, but ideally it can be developed also in parallel with the protocol preparation. This plan outlines how safety will be systematically overseen throughout the trial. So defining what data will be reviewed, at what frequency, who will participate in these reviews, what thresholds will trigger escalation, and what the decision chain looks like. So in short, the safety surveillance plan is the shared operating charter for safety oversight. Then The second component is involving both clinical operations and PV in eligibility review to ensure that exclusion criteria do not impede risk profile characterization in the actual real-life target population. So you don't want to over-exclude patients who are actually representing your target population in the study, and therefore later on have to do an additional safety study in that population or something costly and timely when they could have been involved early on and didn't have to be unnecessarily excluded. So this is especially important in rare disease programs where the enrolled population is small, external reference data is very limited, and the benefit-risk ratio is, of course, uncertain. The third component applies to any multi-regional program. So there should be clearly defined SUSA reporting obligations by the country, and ethics committee and health authority and whoever needs to receive this information, partners, etc. And these obligations should also specify what needs to be reported to whom, within what time frame, and through which channel. In other words, who will be reporting these to which health authorities, ethics committee, investigational review boards, etc. And this shared document should be jointly maintained by the clinical and PV. It should be a live document revisited on regular intervals. The fourth component is, as mentioned, developmental RMP. So that is similar to the post-marketing RMP, of course, but at that point there is less knowledge about the safety profile. So the developmental RMP outlines what is known or anticipated about the investigational product at the current stage of development, including what risks are being monitored, what the risk minimization strategies are, how the effectiveness of those strategies will be evaluated over time, and presented in the aggregate reports. Thus, it provides a framework for robust and comprehensive data collection, focusing on areas of important risks, of course. So the ones that could eventually affect the overall benefit-risk balance of the product, and which need to be effectively prevented and or handled in order for the product to have a positive benefit-risk balance in the end. At the time of approval and later on, of course, that's what I meant. The fifth component, ensuring the standards for coding, severity, grading, causality, etc., are shared and between the clinical team, and ideally are reflected and identical in the EDC and the safety database. So there should also be always a defined reconciliation process, and there should be clear ownership for resolving any discrepancies as they arise, because they do arise. System interoperability among the EDC safety database and reporting tools can enable consistent also signal analytics, KPI dashboards across the program, etc. And the final component is robust investigator brochure maintenance, right? So investigator brochure is a living document and should be treated as such. There are not completely identical expectations about how and when to maintain it globally. But in general, the rule is whenever significant new safety information comes, a new ADR is detected, especially new risk, it should be updated without a delay. So there needs to be very up-to-date information flow between the sites, between the databases, in order to enable this this constant robust maintenance of the investigator brochure. It needs to be defined what is going to trigger, for example, safety committee meetings, and how it will be all handled in a timely manner to make sure IB is always updated and communicated. Not too many updates, not too little updates, just perfect timing of how it should happen.
So now let's talk about what this integrated planning framework looks like from startup through the conduct of a study. The critical objective at startup is really alignment, and we've been talking a lot about that. A joint protocol review that includes clinical operations and PV as design partners can help to surface gaps or overkill in stopping criteria, AE definitions, and communication plans, as well as eligibility parameters before they become amendments. At this time, the safety surveillance plan should be finalized, and if required, the DSMB should be set up. In addition, it is recommended to have a development risk management plan that we've been talking about in place, having an established EDC and safety database standards, a completed SUSAR reporting matrix, and the IB maintenance process should also be documented.
And during study conduct, it's also, of course, essential to maintain this communication and collaboration. There should be standing safety review meetings involving clinical, PV, but also other functions that may be relevant here. So preclinical, regulatory affairs, maybe they're already qualified individuals for pharmacovigilance who are already assigned before the first market authorization. So they all need to be involved here. Monitoring activities and database reconciliation should also, of course, enable all of this together. It should be ongoing, and it is important also for the functions to cooperate in this way, right? So the better they cooperate in real time, there will be a reduced need for subsequent follow-up submissions of any sort. With these mechanisms in place, the signal trends should already be visible to the sponsor safety review committee even before they reach a formal threshold. And that's what you want, to see them up front, to have time to investigate them, to take actions, to complete all the data that is necessary for a comprehensive assessment, rather than just waiting for a threshold, at which point you have very little time to communicate it to authorities, and there may be false alarms, which we want to avoid.
The most important element of issue management is a single escalation and decision-making pathway. When a safety concern emerges, it should be clear who decides what to do and by when. If clinical operations and PV have separate escalation paths, this could lead to inconsistent decisions and really competing timelines. A joint safety review committee is industry best practice. It is worth pointing out that a protocol amendment is almost never just due to a safety event or just an operational event. Every safety-related amendment has operational, regulatory, and site-level dependencies. When clinical operations and PV assess the amendment together before submission, those dependencies can be identified and managed, and really the goal is to reduce the number of amendments that we have. So we thought it might be helpful to consider a real-world example. So we can walk through a scenario that illustrates the value of integrated oversight. If we consider a phase 2 rare disease program that is running in 5 countries with a small patient population and extremely limited external safety reference data, we see that PV identifies an emerging pattern of elevated hepatic enzyme levels in a specific subgroup enrolled at a single site. While the pattern is below the formal reporting threshold, it is notable enough to bring up at the standing joint safety review. At the review, the clinical operations team provides context that was not visible in the safety database. The affected subgroup has a higher baseline rate of concomitant medication use at one particular site, and there was a period of atypical patient flow at that site that could account for the pattern. With that context, overall assessment of causality shifts.
And the response is then targeted monitoring visit to the relevant site and updates to the eligibility screening to capture baseline liver function more systematically, retrain investigators on importance of capturing concomitant medications in EDC and communicating them through ECRFs. So although the threshold of reporting the imbalance to health authority has not been met yet, the team still runs through the reporting metrics to confirm that no reporting obligations have been triggered, because as mentioned before, they can differ from one country to another. The team also evaluates whether eligibility criteria need to be amended, whether the informed consent form needs to be revisited, and whether an investigator letter needs to be issued. The outcome of this, if this is done in a timely manner and with all functions on board, the outcome is typically no protocol amendment, no enrollment hold, and no need for reconsent. So the pattern resolves over the next 2 data cuts, and the benefit risk documentation for the program reflects a process that was coordinated and fully traceable. So now consider what could have happened without integration. If PV had detected the same pattern in isolation, it could have raised a flag to the data safety monitoring boards, led to health authority reporting, and even led to enrollment hold pending further investigation. So integration is a process that involves moving away from a model where data is passed from one silo to another toward a unified model where data is a shared asset. The 6 steps you have here are the most accessible opportunities to build a more connected clinical and safety function, most of which can be implemented during study startup. So first, you need to define a safety review committee with a representation from functions already mentioned before. So of course, clinical, PV, but also regulatory, preclinical, and other functions which may be relevant and to contribute to these committees. There also needs to be a decision log, clear escalation and decision rules. Is it going to be voting? Is it going to be consensus? Is somebody able to make the decision over everybody else? So various models work in practice, but they need to be defined in a charter. Then there is co-authoring of the safety surveillance plan and also a robust safety management plan to ensure the flow is seamless. It needs to define cross-functional workflows that clearly outline who is responsible for data queries. So data queries are a common area, as Deborah mentioned, where the investigators may get aggravated if you oversend them. But at the same time, if you don't query enough, there will be inspection findings. So, for example, if a PV team identifies a discrepancy, there should be a very clear and well-functioning communication path, asking the CRA to verify site records, for example. Then, as mentioned, we recommend establishing developmental RMP, which should be revisited regularly. And when new safety data emerges, it should definitely be revisited. And then there is defining time points for cross-functional review. So for all of these previous steps to work, there need to be defined time points when safety review committee will meet, when the surveillance plan, in the safety surveillance plan, for example, right? But also when to update these documents, when to update safety surveillance plan, monitoring plan, etc. When to update RMP. So the better these time points are defined, it's also easier to coordinate a reconciliation between the databases, taking these time points into consideration. And as we already discussed at length, aligning EDC and safety database, especially at these time points, but ideally completely in real time, is absolutely the backbone of this whole process to work. And then finally, building integration into the vendor selection process. So if the clinical operations and PV are being sourced from different service providers, ensure that there is a robust and clearly defined governance structure. So at Ergomed, we view shared kickoff meetings and safety data exchange agreement as information transfer, not integration. True integration requires ongoing collaboration, communication, and clear escalation pathways. We defined authority and defined responsibilities. We advocate for bringing the PV team into the fold during the protocol development phase, because PV experts can help design the safety sections of the protocol, obviously, right? That's the most straightforward, but they can also ensure that the right data points are being collected from the outset to support long-term risk management. It is also crucial to create a system enabling prompt safety updates to the clinical sites via IB, ICF updates, protocol amendments, and site retraining whenever there are significant updates to any of these documents. So when site study teams can see how their individual contribution and through the CRFs contribute to the evolving and better defined safety profile of the drug, it may not only motivate them to be more involved in the study conduct, recruit more, but also to kind of look at this whole developmental program as something of their own as well.
So we've kind of come to the end of our presentation, but before we open for questions, we wanted to share with you 5 things that we hope you will take away from the time we've spent together today. First, separating clinical operations and PV creates avoidable risk in the form of delayed decisions, unnecessary amendments, inconsistent data, as well as increased site burden. Second, we hope we've shared that safety planning should begin at protocol design, with a safety surveillance plan, a safety management plan, a development RMP, and EDC safety database alignment. Third, integration requires governance and connected oversight. It's not enough to designate any single individual to be the link between functions. Fourth, integrated execution means that a protocol amendment is assessed across all functions before submission, and an IB update flows to sites through a defined process. And finally, when clinical and safety functions are truly integrated from the outset through shared planning, shared governance, and shared decision-making, sponsors can make faster and the most defensible benefit risk assessments. They can reduce downstream rework and protect both patient safety as well as study timelines. But most importantly, fast-track overall product development process.
All right. Thank you, Deborah and Svieta, for the excellent presentation. I'm just going to take us to another poll real quick. So before we transition to the Q&A, we just have another question for you. Which action would most improve clinical PV integration in your current studies? As you take a moment to answer, I'd like to remind you, you can connect directly with our presenters. Their information is located just below me. We see a lot of great questions coming in. Thank you so much for that. Please keep submitting those via the Q&A box. We're going to address as many as we can, and the rest I'll pass along for follow-up offline. So before I ask our first question, Deborah and Svieta, did you have any thoughts on the results of our poll, which I'll take us to now?
So I think it's interesting from my perspective that there seems to be a pretty even split amongst 4 areas. So I think earlier PV input into protocol design, I think we're all, hopefully after the presentation and discussion, on board with that. I do think, again, having these joint committees rather than having individuals that try to connect, I think having everyone together is most important, co-authoring plans and things like that. And I also think the better vendor governance model, I think this is really critical, especially when, you're working in an environment where you may have different vendors kind of supporting clinical as well as PV. But Svieta, I will turn it over to you and see if you have any additional thoughts.
I agree with you, Deborah.
All right, great. I'm going to take us to our first question. So we've gotten several questions about how to avoid silos between clinical operations and PV. What is the earliest point in study plan where integration should happen, and what decisions should be reviewed jointly before protocol finalization?
So I can take this one. I think, as we've been talking about, really integration should begin at protocol development. I would argue, if possible, that it could start even earlier than that. It's not always possible, depending on where sponsors are at in their development. Oftentimes they will have discussions around drafting their protocol and bringing things together before they even outreach to potential vendors to kind of manage clinical and safety. So ideally, if possible, it could even begin at the asset strategy or protocol concept stage. Ideally, at least at a minimum, before the first draft of the synopsis, if we can make that happen. From my perspective, I think some of the minimal things that you need to have in place is really alignment on safety profile assumptions, expected toxicities, and the definitions of SAE and AESI at a minimum.
Great. Our next question: for sponsors working with separate clinical and PV providers, what are the most important governance points to define up front?
I can take this one as well, I guess. From my perspective, there's quite a few things that we could discuss and recommend to kind kind of consider. I think if I had to pick, probably the top 3 or 4 just to bring up in this discussion, and some of them we've touched on already, I think, safety oversight, what that structure looks like from a governance perspective and frequency of reviews and things like that. I do think having a RACI for safety critical workflows, again, just to understand how we're processing SAEs, the intake, how medical review is happening, coding review, that sort of thing. We talked a little bit about vendors, but I think cross-vendor communication expectations are also important, and really to outline them and make sure everyone on every side is kind of on board and understands what those expectations are. And I think one last one I would bring up is really just making sure that overall there's ownership around inspection readiness. So just making sure there's clarity around TMF ownership, safety document filing responsibility, audit trail governance, CAPA ownership, things like that. Because again, we're all working in an environment where we want to maintain and be ready for any inspections that may come up.
Great. From the PV side, what are the most common data or process gaps that make safety oversight harder during a clinical trial? And how can sponsors prevent those gaps before they affect ICSR processing, signal review, or reporting?
Well, I would say the most common gaps are really about this seamless communication and information, right? So not to send too little, but also not to send too much to safety at the same time. So if the sites are not trained on the proper filling out of CRF forms, they can sometimes send, that data dumps of medical records, which can be hundreds of pages long. And it is not even clear what they wanted to report as an SAE sometimes, right? So the gaps are definitely in the finding between all of these stakeholders, finding the right level of the information that needs to be shared for the safety assessments to work, for the safety database to be robust enough, to avoid any over-reporting, because we just didn't have enough information and we were then overcautious and saying, yeah, it's possibly related, when in fact, if you had all the medical history, if you had all the concomitant information, if you had all the relevant workup data rather than every possible test that was made to the patient, it would be very easy to conclude the causal association is unlikely, and what are the actual more likely causes of the events, right? So it is really about finding that the gaps are typically in finding that good balance and providing it in real time, right? So you don't have 7 follow-ups to a case if it's not necessary. So 1 follow-up is typically necessary, but 7 not. So this also indicates, these are some of the things that can also indicate that there is a gap in the seamless flow of the information.
Thank you. Our next question is someone asking for clarification on safety monitoring versus a safety management plan. Just noting that a slide indicated monitoring, but you were speaking to a management plan. So could you provide additional context there?
Yeah, I can take that as well.
Thank you.
So these are 2 different plans, right? Both are important to have. They can be called different names. They can maybe even be integrated into like one umbrella document, although I haven't seen that really in practice. So the monitoring plan is mainly the accountability of the monitors, right? So the medical monitors, how to do it on-site, remotely, et cetera, so in line with the GCP. And safety management plan is how the safety information should flow from one function to another. So that's, as I said, they do have some touch points, but they are actually different processes. And for the safety management plan, the ultimate accountability is with the safety function or the pharmacovigilance function of the sponsor, right? So those are the differences, but both are very important.
Thank you very much. Our next question, what are the warning signs that clinical operations and PV are operating in parallel rather than as an integrated team?
Really good question. I can take this one as well. couple of examples that I can think of that maybe would kind of help elaborate a little bit. I've seen, where we end up with different versions of study reality. So potentially the operations team is reporting green status on the study, while PV backlog might be growing. Sites might appear compliant operationally, but we see that the SAE follow-up is poor. So again, to me, that's one of those red flags or kind of a warning sign. I think also if SAE reconciliation becomes a chronic issue, where maybe we're seeing frequent EDC versus safety database mismatches, or potentially disagreement over ownership, I think this is another sign that we kind of need to bring those teams together and try to work on integration. I've seen instances where potentially discussions occur outside of these core study governance. So even if you have a plan in place and you're working on integrating the team, but somehow you now have, for instance, separate trackers from different sides, that's another sign that I would say, maybe you need to revisit what that integration looks like. And maybe lastly, you might see some misalignment around from the medical monitor as well as the safety physician. So again, sometimes, it's overlap. It might be the same individual, but sometimes it's different. And I think that's another kind of warning sign that I would look for, and really a sign that you need to reevaluate and focus on alignment better.
Thank you. Another question asking if you could elaborate on the benefits of having both the SSP and DRMP when there's an overlap of content.
I can take that one. Yeah, so there can be some overlap of contents, that's true, but it's really minimal typically, because the safety surveillance plan is more like a signal and risk management SOP, which should define what is being monitored by who at which intervals, what are, for example, anticipated events in the study, right? So something that is expected to be happening in the study population, irrespective of the study protocol being used, irrespective of any study treatment being given to the patient, just because these events are happening in the target population anyway. So in the safety surveillance plan, you would define these things, for example, they would never be defined in the DRMP. And in the safety surveillance plan, you would define what is the threshold of these anticipated events after, and when you reach it, you become concerned that maybe this product is increasing that risk. So let's say you have an elderly population with a cardiovascular risk. So the typical example, right? You would define that these are anticipated events and that you will not consider them related to the study protocols on individual case level, but only after you reach a certain threshold. But you need to define what the threshold it is, like what percentage of subjects can just experience a major cardiovascular event, and this is just considered to be still within the baseline incidence rate, right? And at which point you will raise a suspicion that perhaps this protocol is increasing the risk of cardiovascular events. So that's the type of things that are defined in the safety surveillance plan. When you will unblind a certain number of cases in order to do a comprehensive comparison between the arms. Those are the sorts of things that are not defined in the developmental RMP. On the other hand, developmental RMP focuses on the potential risks. So what is already known with other drugs from the class or otherwise similar treatments for the condition, and therefore could be expected to be also the risks of this new treatment. So and that is something that may not be defined in the safety surveillance plan, right? So these important potential risks, how to monitor these important potential risks at the site, but also how to look at the aggregate data as it accumulates, at which point you will consider this important potential risk to be an important identified risk or a known ADR, a known risk, and you need to maybe introduce some additional management actions into the protocol And of course, information into the IB, ICF, maybe you need to reconsent the subject. So those kind of various safety actions that can be taken, those actions would be defined in the RMP rather than the safety surveillance plan. So as I said, they do slightly overlap, but they have two distinct roles overall. The role of the first one is on the detection, and the role of the second one is on management, prompt identification of just the key risks and the management of these key risks.
Great. And how should sponsors decide which safety issues require cross-functional escalation versus routine PV handling?
Yeah, so safety issues by definition require cross-functional escalation. So maybe this is more of a discussion of when to consider something to be a new safety issue, or to consider something to introduce a significant change in the characterization of a known safety issue. So that's how it's typically defined in this, let's say, signal risk management SOPs. So safety review committees, which we encourage you to have, can meet on a regular basis, look at all the new data in a blinded manner, right? As long as it's blinded. And then together decide whether there is something significantly new about this, any kind of safety topic. Or they can adjourn upon identification of a potential signal, as defined in the safety surveillance plan, signal management, SOPs, etc. So there are typically these two ways in how these committees operate, and they, as I said, they are the ideal way of cross-functional escalation pattern. Right? The safety monitoring committee should have all the relevant functions in it, and there can be several layers of these committees. So there can be the, let's say, more operational lower layer who decides what is a new signal, and then a higher level which decides whether safety actions need to be taken after the comprehensive signal assessment. So at that higher level, you would have CMO, CSO, head of regulatory group, and functions like that, right? Maybe head of preclinical, maybe head of epidemiology, depending who is involved in this study planning and conduct. And at the lower operational level, you would have, let's say, a drug safety lead or global safety officer for the product. You would have the clinical safety lead for the studies. So it's more of a, it's not executive management, it's more of a main SMEs for that product, who are, again, cross-functional representatives. So I hope this addresses the question.
Of course. How can clinical teams help PV teams improve ICSR quality without increasing unnecessary site burden?
I can start with that and give my perspective. I think it's not necessarily an easy one to answer. I think simply because there's a lot of variability. I do think that site communication, site training is most critical, and I think that needs to be ongoing. I also think, at least from my perspective, what I've seen in clinical is often there are conversations that are happening, potentially, for instance, between an investigator and a medical monitor, and we need to ensure that all of that information that's being shared is being captured with everyone, again, to make sure that what we're hearing from sites, we're not losing that information so they don't start to get frustrated, that feeling that they've already provided it, but also making sure, again, from the beginning, that we're very clear about kind of what the process looks like, what's going to be required. Again, just to minimize the frustration on their side, make them a part of the process, and make sure they recognize the importance of, obviously the data and the patient knowledge that they have to the process, but again, trying to limit the number of different inquiries and outreach that we've done to them to make sure we just have a unified process. Sveta, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
No, I completely agree. I completely agree with what you said. Yes, it is absolutely investigators kind of taking the ownership and feeling, involved here rather than bullied. That's the secret recipe.
Thank you both. We have another question here asking, to what extent are you reviewing AE data in labs as part of the safety surveillance? Is it in a blinded study?
I could take that one. This is typically part of the, let's say, signal management process and safety surveillance plan. So it's study by study, right? So it needs to be defined in the safety surveillance plan, what to look for. As I mentioned earlier, there can be some anticipated events, which can be A data, which can be labs, right? Indicating that there is something happening, right? And that, let's say, abnormal shifts from baseline are happening more than we anticipated that they would be happening based on the background rates. So they can be reviewed from that perspective without unblinding them until they reach a certain threshold, or they can be reviewed, of course, when the study ends and everything is unblinded. But during, I guess this question is more focused on the blinded stage, right? How to avoid too much unblinding unnecessarily. So at that point, so unless they reach some threshold, and you can look at them, you typically focus on what are the areas of interest, adverse events of special interest, key risks, and defined anticipated events with defined thresholds. You focus on these areas typically, right? But then if any signal emerges, right, then during the comprehensive signal assessment, you need to look at all the available data. And so at that point, you will decide to unblind even non-serious adverse event data, even labs that have been reported for the purpose of this assessment. And then it can be handled in different ways. We definitely recommend that only the safety team, the pharmacovigilance team, gets unblinded. And if their unblinded analysis reaches a conclusion that some safety actions need to be taken, protocol amendment, IB amendment, ICF, whichever, right? At that point, they bring this unblinded information to the safety review committee, but not before. So it is possible to unblind just part of this team, the team who actually crunches the numbers. And if their number crunch doesn't indicate everybody needs to be unblinded, you don't, because we always want to avoid any unnecessary unblinding.
All right, thank you very much. That is going to be all the time that we have left for today. Just want to assure the audience, don't worry if we didn't get to your question. I will be passing them along to our presenters for follow-up offline. I'd like to thank Deborah, Svieta, Ergomed, and Prime Vigilance for providing their expertise today, and you, the audience. We appreciate you being with us and hope to see you again soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day.